listeners to Connect the Dots. I'm Alison Rose Levy, and I'm here with you every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network. Our show begins with a excerpt from Bobby McFerrin's The Garden. And, you know, I think it's always apropos because for all the trappings of civilization that we live with and become sort of entangled with and surrounded by, and that are, you know, we're interactive with and everything, there is this larger context of nature and the earth and the growing and living things, all of them, of which we are one species. And so we're going to kind of go a bit deeper into that dimension today with my guest, who I'm really thrilled to have with us. His name is Martin Shaw. He's a PhD and the author of Courting the Wild Twin, a new book published by Chelsea Green. He's written many books, including the Myth Teller Trilogy and one called Cinderbiter. What a wonderful name for some reason, with Tony Hoagland. Martin Shaw is an acclaimed scholar and author and director of the Westcountry School of Myth in the UK. He created the Oral Tradition and Mythic Life courses at Stanford University here in the U.S., and he's guided wilderness rites of passage for 20 years. I've read his recent book, Courting the Wild Twin, and we'll be talking about nature, about myth, and about story, and how we can how story can enrich and inform our deepening in wild times. So welcome to Connect the Dots, Martin Shaw. So glad to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So I finished your book. In fact, I kept delaying the interview because I wanted to read Courting the Wild Twin slowly rather than kind of gallop through it to get it finished. I was kind of dragging it out so that it wouldn't end. But I wanted to have completed it, before we spoke. And I think, that kind of reflects something very special about the book and about the storytelling in myth. And it, I have to say, it brought me back to some of my own roots, which I may discuss a little bit more onward into the conversation. But you have devoted your whole life to myth and storytelling, and why? I don't want to give you some summary type question, that then you have to encapsulate as if you're writing a course for a university catalog or something. But why? Why are myth and storytelling so essential?
Great question. I think my interest in it all began through financial poverty. When I was a child, I grew up in a house where we didn't have a lot of money. So there was no television, there was no car, there was no telephone, but there were a lot of books, a lot of conversation, and behind the house, there was a great forest. So this kind of entanglement of story and place was with me from a very early age, because quite honestly, I didn't have many distractions. Books were always a place where I went for my imagination to do its yoga. That's the way I've been thinking about it today. Stories are a kind of yoga for the imagination. And in the kind of time we're actually in right now, lockdown, I can't see a more important medium, to be honest, or certainly it's as important as anything else I can think, than thinking in myth. Because long before we had, iPads or journals or anything like that, we had the currency of story to deepen our circumstance. And the kind of unique moment for all of us right now is that we are all in this. This isn't happening to a depressed friend or a sick relative. This is across the board, this kind of enforced contemplation. So it's a very difficult for some people, but also transformational and potentially kind of exhilarating moment. Stories traffic in the day that everything changed. So in other words, the stories as a culture we choose to remember are not the day which was just like the last one. It's the day when you were tested to your very limits, to your core. And so as I got older, and this is an identical story, I'm sure, to the majority of the people listening, you grow older, you go through heartbreak, you go through illness, you go through divorce, you go through depression, and you're looking, if not for a roadmap exactly, you're looking for things that point a way to deepening your understanding of the experience. And it was then that I remembered the stories I'd loved as a kid in that little house in Devon in England in the early 70s. So I went back and reread Grimm's, reread the Arthurian stories, but carrying the weight of an older man rather than a child. And suddenly, to my astonishment, these stories they exfoliate like a flower. The more attention you give them, the more reward. So it was lovely for me to hear you just then talking about you delaying the ending of Courting the Wild Twin. That's perfect, because in a way, the more you drag it out, the more moisture or the more nourishment you're going to get. So to be honest, my story begins with lack and limit, but within that limit, I managed to go deeper. And that's really when the stories have been my very faithful companion now for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you begin in an entirely different place? Because it sounds like it was a very natural evolution out of your own childhood, or did you, make an attempt at, more civilized life and then come back to this, or, what? Just curious about that.
Yep. Well, when I was young, the work that I do now, if we use the word mythologist, storyteller, wilderness rites of passage, I had no idea that any of that existed. These just were not terms that people around me used. So I wouldn't have had any idea that there was even a model for what I'm doing now. Of course there is, but I didn't know about it. So the nearest I ever got to respectability was being a rock and roll musician. That's as conventional as I ever got. When I was about 11, my dad put drums in front of me because he's a drummer, and the discipline of playing, which was great because I wasn't doing well at school. I was not encouraged. Every report I ever had told me that I was a dreamer, which actually turned out to be rather true. So the only other thing that I've ever done is play the drums and travel as a musician. But by my early 20s, so this is again well over 20 years ago, even that seemed rather domestic. In actual fact, I lost interest in rock and roll as an art form for a while. I love it now, but it's like anything in life. If you do something a lot, you can get weary of it. So it was only when actually my own life, my own attempts to play music, an early marriage that had disintegrated, it was only when a lot had fallen away that ironically I actually found out what it was I wanted to do with my life. But as I've said, there were no guarantees, because the kind of things I was interested in, I simply had no sense of how you could ever, put bread on the table or earn a living from it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That makes sense for sure. It's funny because I've had a recurring encounter with this field without, ever thinking to take it up, although I am kind of a, nonfiction storyteller, really. That's what a reporter and journalist is and does and
Yes.
stuff like that. Because I encountered both Joseph Campbell and Victor Turner at various turns of my life and was instructed, by then, learned from them and, had the opportunity for being influenced by them. So, and of course, Campbell, had this prodigious work of looking into, multiple mythics of all cultures. And Turner also kind of returned myth and ritual and initiation to its rightful place at the core of what had become a more economically and academically oriented field of anthropology. But I kind of felt in reading this book, Courting the Wild Twin, that it was almost like back to the beginning. The theme of the book, I sort of don't want to spoil it by describing it or anything, but it is to do with twins and with the kind of wished for twin that's the embodiment of the highest virtues that a culture prizes, and then this additional twin who is embodying something else. I don't know if that sets a frame for you to talk a little bit about the book, or the theme. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. First of all, I would like to say how lucky you were early on in life to come across people like Victor Turner and Campbell. England has a different root system in a way in terms of this kind of information. So I was growing up with different writers. I mean, I've worked a lot in America now, so I'm very familiar with the sort of the world of Joseph Campbell, and I'm a huge admirer of Victor Turner, and I consciously lent on some of Victor Turner's ideas in Courting the Wild Twin. So I'm very pleased that you caught that. There is a very old idea. You get it in tribal societies, you get it in folk tales, and it's very simple. The night or the day you were born, you had a twin that was effectively sent into exile, thrown out of the window, abandoned. You're not told about this twin. So you grow up, and at some point, usually in adolescence or your early 20s, you begin to hear rumors of this twin that culture at large would rather you did not know about. And so the fairy tales that I have explored, they're two very specific stories that deal with this, are how on earth in modernity, in modern life, because these old stories exist perfectly in our time, how would we call an exiled energy like that back into relationship with our life, and what is the kind of trouble we can expect? So in other words, if you sent something into exile 20 years ago, they're not going to come back thrilled. They're probably going to come back furious. And so the story really explores through, or the book explores through anecdotes, personal recollections, the stories themselves, how we deal all the way through our lives with energies that we long were sent into exile, either by us or by our immediate family. In other words, the more we behave, the more we are domesticated, our connection with that gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So the book really is a kind of an attempt to explore how we could, as I said, using the title says it really, how do we court these beings back? I actually wrote it almost not quite in one sitting, but it was something like it. It was very unusual. A book normally will take me years, and that, although it's a small book, it still took days. doesn't mean the quality of the book is affected in any way. It just means that was the moment where those ideas, those thoughts, those images were going to arrive at the desk. So I wrote it all out almost in a fever, sent it off to Chelsea Green. And the delight now is now I actually have the book in front of me. To some degree, I've forgotten an enormous amount of what I wrote there. So ironically, get this, in lockdown, I'm being educated by the book I wrote before lockdown.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Very
wow.
odd.
Yeah. What are you learning from it that you didn't know?
Well, first of all, most books, I'm sure you experience this as a journalist. There are things. No one is a harsher critic of the work usually than the author themselves. But because I have this distance from it, I've been softer with it than I normally would. I enjoy it as a piece of work. It is, what am I learning from it? What is the instruction from it? The instruction from it actually is to stick with the uncomfortability of this moment that we're culturally in. Mm-hmm. To really stay curious to the discomfort rather than, to be honest, trying to cram my life with distractions. If I really want to have a relationship with the wild twin, they're not going to be attracted to me if I'm continually multitasking. The wild twin for me right now is this experience. That's how it's actually shown up. It said, okay, so for example, I am now 5 weeks. I live alone in a cottage. I've gone about 5 weeks. I really haven't seen anybody other than I get to see my daughter a bit, who's a teenager. And, it reminds me of wilderness rites of passage. But the difference is, if you go out and fast on the hill, you have some kind of community to return to. But we're all doing this. Mm-hmm. We're to a greater degree or not, we're all doing it. So at the moment, what I'm learning about is not naming this experience too quickly. The book seems to be telling me just to sit in it and let the story tell you what it is rather than tell the story what it is, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it totally makes sense. And that's one of the reasons why, I wasn't trying to tell or frame the story in a certain kind of way, because, then it becomes like, this marketing description that kind of sits upon the thing and has an unpleasant weight of crushing it. So, that's interesting. My medium in this, I write articles and, for different publications, and I also do a lot of curating of content and commenting on things that are happening in public life, as well as having a circle of people who are reading and commenting and discussing and contending and, bemoaning and all of those kinds of things. And I have to say that my own experience in this time is that all that is happening, the tenor of everything that is happening outside of the place that one is sheltering, and it is creating the systems and structures and happenings of the world as they devolve. It seemingly in many different ways, or people call for what would be wonderful to progress. It's almost like, having been so engaged in the middle of that and very optimistic about what we collectively could bring about. There is through both the drive of the historic circumstances as well as the contrast, between the introspective at-home experience and this kind of tumult. The question that keeps coming up for me is, we can name these things. Many of them are horrible. We can grieve them. But the sense that, and, I'm one who's always recruited people to a sense of agency. So the sense that we have agency to do something or to influence, seems more questionable to me. And I'm not sure if it's because it's true or because I'm feeling it more because of the context that we're all in, because of the space to feel it more.
Yeah, that's where I am too. The way I would think about it in my line of work is to describe it like this. If we are going through what you could loosely call an initiation experience, the way that I understand that term in my own practice with wilderness rites of passage is that you leave the familiar, you go out into a forest or on the top of the hill, and for 4 days and nights, you fast, in the old Lakota sense of the word, crying for vision, looking for a way forward, deeply contemplating. But it is only on the return from that encounter does any real wisdom grow. It can't be hurried, in other words. So I grow concerned sometimes that we culturally are not at the moment yet where the real insights are going to come, because we simply haven't brooded long enough. Now I'm actually under attack from a lot of my friends who say, listen, it's a nice idea, but we simply don't have the time for that. We've got to think on our feet right now. It has to be rapid response. But any tribal group that I've ever been around, I think, would counter that desire for action with some real contemplation at this moment. And for me, I know something is valuable when it makes me feel uncomfortable. And the fact that I am trying to just sit in this, because for me, I have a few insights, but I don't yet have, I haven't returned from this experience yet. In other words, in the language of Victor Turner that you used, we're in the liminal.
Right.
And when you're in the liminal, that's the moment to have the experience, but not to theorize about the experience. That's something that comes when you return from it.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about the liminal? Because when even saying his name, Victor Turner, that word comes up right along with it. And I don't think it's widely understood, in terms of its meaning and all.
Of course I would. Liminal is a really interesting word because it's it describes a very broad spectrum of experience. Liminal could be as amplified as a kind of spiritual or religious encounter, like the burning bush in the desert, or it could be you on a train daydreaming out of a window for an hour between cities. But it seems to be a moment where you drift, where you are unshackled from your usual job description as a mother or as a journalist or as a writer or as a member of any particular community, and your imagination takes a walk. Now, in a rite of passage or an initiation, that gets accelerated and amplified to the point of, visionary experiences. But the liminal, in the way that I understand it, and I think the way Turner was getting at, is when you are temporarily broken free from the normal restrictions of your thought into something bigger. There's a very old idea that you get, again, in tribal setups, but you also get it in the Renaissance, that a human soul is not entirely in their own body. That as you walk around in your life, your soul, for the most part, is outside of you, not inside. So all this kind of Western stuff where we're always kind of clutching our chest and talking about our soul is seen as a bit naive. The real soulful encounters happen outside of us. And so to be in the liminal is to be very aware of soul in action around us. That's a little description of the liminal that I would say. Now, whilst we're on the subject, though, Victor Turner has another word that is very similar to liminal, but is a little different in emphasis, and it's this word liminoid. Now, liminoid is when you have the experience of the liminal, but you are unable to make much of it. So a liminal experience, to be honest, could be the excruciating ending of a love affair. And for a while, you can't eat, you can't sleep, but God Almighty, in some strange way, you've never felt so alive. That's the liminal. And if you pay attention to that, over time, that can become wisdom. And you know it's wisdom because you are able to share it and give it to other people. But the liminoid is when you had the horrendous divorce, but your mouth grew bitter from it, not wise. And that for me is very interesting, that trauma alone is not necessarily sacred. The context and the deeper brooding in that is what can make all the difference.
Wow, that's brilliant. Yes, that makes sense. And then for that too, you need time. I mean, you need to slow down the pace and stretch it out, rather than to precipitate.
That's it. And I mean, I'm as impatient as anyone else is. I love part of the speed of modern life and modernity, but I know by and large, and I remember saying this actually in Courting the Wild Twin, the quick route is very rarely your friend. Mm-hmm. The quick route is very rarely your friend, and I'm as addicted to it as anyone else. But when I'm really paying attention, I try and slow things down a little. Actually, you again, thinking of you slowing down your reading of the book, the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney said a sweet thing. He said, when I was younger and I was writing books, it was always a race to the finish. I wanted the big climax. That's what I was pushing for with all my youthful energy. And he says, of course, when I get older, and of course we can relate to this to all sorts of other erotic activities, I want to slow the whole thing down. I want it to take as long as I possibly can. And I really want to linger over the sheer joy of creation. So that's Seamus Heaney is definitely one of my honorary elders. So I try and pay attention to that.
Yeah, that also, I think it has to do with the aging process over a lifetime too, because, when one is building and establishing and trying to get somewhere and thinking that there's somewhere to get, that's very different than when in a time in the life cycle that's bending the curve more toward mortality in the end, and also with a planet that with an Earth and system that is basically on the has been on a route of very destructive behavior, and hasn't course corrected yet. So there's also a lot of intimations of mortality or potentials for mortality in the more mature part of the life cycle, and also very much in this time where people are dying, and what do we make of that? This is a little off topic, but since we're talking about the time as well, I'd be, interested to hear your perspective on any of those questions.
Well, very big questions. Yeah, people are dying. People are dying. It's beginning to creep, not imperceptibly, but very perceptibly into my family, friends of family, are dying here and there. And it was ever thus, in any village, there's always an old man dying in a hut, and there's always children playing by the stream 30 yards away. It absolutely is part of the inexorable cycle of life. We are incredibly defended against it, most of us. By the time we get older, we start to experience it. But I think it is a shock that a very sort of clear and present danger has arrived. And one of the things I have been counseling really is for us that are raising younger children to take care of the anxiety levels that come into the house with this information. I do believe that as parents, we are caretakers. And I see some of my friends so sort of spun out by the information they have about coronavirus, far more than they actually need at this moment. Their children are absolutely tied up in knots. And I think to some degree we need to curate that. It doesn't mean that we don't talk candidly to our children about the nature of our times, but also the opportunity of the times that we're in. As you've said, that actually it could be their generation. Hopefully we'll also have something to do with it. That changes the mood of our times. So that's all that I can say about it at present. I actually did something as a storyteller that I've never done before, which is because I have a child, and I have lots of nieces and nephews and godchildren dotted around the place. For the first time ever, I just made little videos of me telling stories for kids. My clientele is usually somewhere between 20 and 103. But actually, I found it a really lovely thing to do, to sit down with very meaty little folk tales and tell them as if there was a group of 7 to 10-year-olds in front of me. So now I finally, for the first time in my life, I have this cherub army of support. I've had hundreds of letters from families, from little kids, from all the way from Hawaii to Alaska to Australia to New Zealand, all these little kids getting turned on to myth. Because the deal is, I'll tell them the story, but then they have to tell it to someone else. The oral tradition, you're very familiar with this. So in all of this, I've got off my high horse and done something I never expected to do, which is to tell stories to kids. And it is the best thing ever. And if anybody is listening to this and they've got a story, get it out there, get it round a virtual campfire and start telling the stories, because not only will they nurture some of the people around you, you yourself will get a full battery charge by passing it on.
Yes, that's a lot of that goes on Facebook. There's a lot of, not mythic, but true life experience storytelling. Yeah. I know I do a lot of it, because all the different things that come sifting through bring up different learning moments of various kinds. Where can people find your stories online? Are they online so that children can access them, or their parents can?
Two places. One is, you literally can find me on Facebook, Martin Shaw. You'll see my bearded face very quickly on there. And you go to my page, anybody can see it. It's public, and I post videos there. But also on Vimeo, if you put in Dr. Martin Shaw, you'll get actually all the videos, plus many, many others that have been made about me or my work over the last 2 or 3 years. So Vimeo, Dr. Martin Shaw, Facebook, Martin Shaw, and they're all free. So please, I encourage anybody, learn the stories yourself, pass them on, and enjoy the videos. And if you like them, please share them.
Wonderful. Yeah, I hope I'm going to definitely do that, because I post on Facebook a lot of cultural events and uplifting events, and music, and because we really need the soul food to sustain through these times. And I know I do, so I sort of assume everyone does, and that's I think it's really it's a great provision when we're stockpiling our provisions. Let's take another pathway into your book, Courting the Wild Twin. I'm not sure where this will take us, but just to briefly say for listeners, without spoiling the book, there's much in it, and part of what's in it are two tales of two different twins and wild twins, and they're kind of parallel stories but different in their own ways. And one of the distinguishing features is that in one case the twins are male twins, and in the other they are female twins. I'm just I don't know. I don't have a specific question about that, but I would love to hear you reflect on some of the what emerges when these very parallel stories are told for one of the two of our multiple genders, that exist and all.
That's a great inquiry. Not quite a question, but an inquiry, which is really good. It's interesting, isn't it? I think in the last 30 years, anybody that's listening to this that enjoys and reads myth are probably, maybe aware of two writers. One is Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote Women That Run with the Wolves. The second one is my old mentor, Robert Bly, who wrote a book called Iron John. Now, both of these books they open up the 1990s. They're right at the beginning of the 90s. They opened up a conversation where myth really became an incredible way about talking about gender, addressing a gender, gender, and all the kind of gradients between men and women. I have always worked, interestingly, primarily in my own school, which I have. I've always worked with mixed groups. That's always given me the greatest pleasure. I have worked with groups of men at men's conferences, which is fine. But I have to tell you something. By and large, I don't think that my work would have existed without specifically the support of women. Women tend to buy more books, as far as I can tell. So straight away, there's two things going on. One is that I'm raising a daughter. I'm not raising a son. So there's a kind of particular attention that I have around the feminine, because the thing that I love most in the world is this little girl. So I wanted her to grow up not just absorbing these stories, but to be actually able to tell them herself. So when you have a 4-year-old girl learning a story like Tatterhood, which is in the book, which is an incredible reflection on what is it like to live a life not crippled by shame. What does it mean to really show up to the party? The poet Rilke has a line. He says, "Wherever I am folded, there I am a lie." And as we get older and we get more distanced from the twin, I find that I get more and more folded. And what these books do is they open our wingspan again. Beautiful thing. So I know for me, one of the stories is about the success of growing up in proximity to the wild twin, the gorgeous vivacity of the kind of character you can grow into. But the other story, ironically, the twin of the twin, is a story about what happens when that doesn't occur. It's a story called The Lindworm, where actually you do not have access to the vitality and the wit of the wild twin. You're rather leaden in your behavior. There's a kind of energy missing. You don't have the energy to galvanize yourself. You don't have the energy to vote. You don't have the energy to really be involved in much. That would, in mythic terms, and actually in the words of someone I'm sure we're familiar with, at least as a name, William Blake, it's the phrase pinpricks of the eternal. There's not enough eternity in your day. These are stories that whether you're a man or a woman or whatever, however you choose to identify yourself, we all need more than the facts of the matter. The facts of the matter tend to give us burnout, especially if we're activists. I work with hundreds over a period of a year, probably thousands of people involved in activism. And one of the things that I'm always advising is, listen, if you keep staring into hell without any artistry, you're going to experience burnout. Mm-hmm. And we don't want you to have burnout. We want you to be nourished, and we want you to say hard things when you've got to say them, but we want your soul to be edified and protected in the process. It's like these myths where you're encountering a monster, and if you look at the monster, they can turn you to ashes. But if you look at the reflection of the beast on your shield, you've got some negotiation. For me, stories like the ones in the book are the shields as we face the monster. They're a kind of artistry where we get a reflection of the situation. But if we keep looking only directly at it, if there's no beauty sewn into the conversation, then most of us get wiped out pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's an amazing insight. Speaking as an activist, one of the things I really like about it is that what I've often noticed is that when sort of self-described spiritual people who were more focused on a life of giving themselves nourishing experiences and celebrating that, and who were then therefore kind of disengaged from acknowledging the inequities, which are, possibly unethical and unspiritual, there's a kind of disconnect. And so then that is turned, critically toward activists. And, and there's always a sort of sense of moral superiority in avoiding that particular dilemma. That you just so aptly described, where your framing of it is actually protective and supportive.
Yeah.
And, so I really honor that because, when, very often I'm proposed to have different authors of spiritual works who are, from the American Let's Fix It tradition or something, come on the program, and the wild twin of what our constructed world costs the people we don't see, is unacknowledged, and therefore the cosmology always seems really flawed to me. And I don't want to get into a debate about that, so I frequently just tell the publicists, forget it. So, but you somehow, through the Earth connection and the connection to the wild and to myth, are holding the entire thing in a much more integral way. And thank you for that. Really, thank you.
Well, thank you. A little clue that I learned early and has really stood by me well is this. Once you've led a rite of passage out in the bush, if you've actually gone through that, the easy thing to do is to presume that the experience is now finished. It culminated in your return. But actually, from an indigenous perspective, that kind of contemplation, divorced from action, is a malfunction. It hasn't worked. It is in the end a form of vanity. It's yet again a human being going out into the wider earth and using it as a backdrop whilst they attempt to, fix themselves. The older way is much more profound than that, where actually, if it's worked, what you do with the encounter is to find a communicable art form that in the end edifies others. That doesn't mean you showboat about it. It doesn't mean that you become a guru. It doesn't mean that you use it as a form of spiritual one-upmanship, but it's just something you quietly carry about with you in whatever form it shows up in, whether it's your writing or your storytelling or the way you build a boat or the way you run a nursery or the way you look after your mother. But in some way, and it's a beautiful word actually, kindness moves from you in this, some real deep down proper goodness. And that, if you're in a tribal community, that's when they say, this works, something actually happened. So what I'm always looking for in the teachers that inspire me is the gifting in what they're saying. It almost, to some degree, it's what they're saying, but I'm always listening to why they're saying it. And are they really moving something on? And if they are, they have my loyalty for life.
Oh, it's beautiful. Since you mentioned the indigenous, I would love to hear you share, your, any kind of experience or, kind of what that holds, what the indigenous way holds that, we don't haven't that much opportunity to see or experience, perhaps, or maybe some of us do, in contemporary life.
Good. Again, great inquiry. One of the things I deliberately did with Courting the Wild Twin was use two not terribly well-known fairy tales. I did that because I felt whoever was reading the book, of whatever pigment, whatever ethnic background, could claim them as their own without any ripple of cultural appropriation. There's no village in Yorkshire in England that's going to say, we're very angry because you're using the story of the lindworm for your own soulful benefit. They belong in a kind of commons of the imagination. However, as you travel the world, you realize a very interesting thing, that some stories, some myths, some folk tales have a universality to them. They're designed to travel. They're nomadic. Now, this is what Campbell was getting at with the Hero of a Thousand Faces. There are pressure points that we all recognize from the human experience. But on the other hand, there are stories that come from a very particular place. And they refer to a bend in the river where the salmon meet. They refer to a particular set of mountains. They have a kind of sacred geography to them that when the story is told, they are renaming and re-enchanting the world over and over again. Those are not stories that I would choose to tell if I didn't come from that culture. That for me is when I'm careful about it. You approach each story with caution and you figure out, how do I feed this story? How do I edify it? Is it willing to travel with me or not? But years ago, I was sitting with a very well-known African teacher, a tribal leader, and he suddenly turned to me on my right in front of a group full of people and said, "This is an indigenous teacher. He's not American, he's British, and his people have been in that part of Britain for hundreds and hundreds of years. He has an indigenosity of a sort." Now, whether or not that's correct, I don't really know. It was a nice thing to hear. But it is interesting to me that the British predicament around land, story, all of that is a little different to when I'm over in America. I mean, the fascinating thing for me about America is that in Celtic myth, whenever you go west, you head into what we call the other world. That's a place you go to heal. It's a place where people go to die, but it's not our world. It's the other world. So when the ships sailed off, it's only 20 miles down the road from where I'm talking to you. When they sailed off from Plymouth, or they sailed off from Galway, from an English or a British or a European perspective, you're sort of sailing into the other world. And whenever I'm teaching in America, I'm always aware that to some degree I'm off my native ground. And that is a fascinating thing for me. I have been luckily in the company of many indigenous tribal groups since I've been in America, and we've always just got on well. There's always just been a sense of, for God's sake, keep doing what you're doing, because actually the world is on fire, and any cultural vitality that we can find right now, we desperately need. So I've been in, there's a tribe in Northern California called the Miwok. I have been at the very center of the Longhouse in their deep and magical celebrations of the young men and the young women becoming adults. And the story they want to hear at that moment is a European fairy tale. Isn't that extraordinary? That kind of back and forth. And for me, if it's done, if everybody understands the sort of spiritual authority of the moment, that it's not cheap, it's actually sacred, sometimes this can happen. And so I'm very grateful for when it does, but I'm also very careful about the stories that I tell.
That's so interesting. I really enjoy that perspective, because instead of talking about what the indigenous hold, you're speaking of your learning about stories through them, through the encounters with them and all. And, so that's a form of care, humility, and reverence toward, those most ancient and enduring in their culture on this planet. I think we're coming to the end of our show fairly soon, so I just want to alert listeners to look for Martin Shaw's book. We've been speaking with storyteller, folklorist, mythologist, scholar, and author Martin Shaw, and mostly about his book Courting the Wild Twin, but actually Martin is quite prolific. You can go to his Facebook page and find some of his videoed storytellings for children. He's written a whole bunch of books, so I have something to look forward to here. Cinderbiter with Tony Hoagland, The Night Wages, Wolf Milk, Courting the Dawn, Poems of Lorca with Stefan Harding, The Five Fathoms, Myth Teller Trilogy, and many more. Courting the Wild Twin is published by Chelsea Green Publishing, a U.S. publisher, and highly recommended for reading in these sheltering times. Thank you so much for being with us today on Connect the Dots, Martin. And maybe any parting words to our listeners for this time and for when we come out of it, because you've said that the initiation is upon the return. So I'd love to hear any, additional, learnings you have to offer about that.
Thank you. First of all, I would simply like to say, take courage. Dig in, take courage. And I don't know, I have no idea the age of the folk that are listening, but I know that as I get older, sometimes it's hard to have a sense of personal self-esteem. But I'm going to ask all of us to make a very rash thought, and it's that actually this moment in your life has arrived perfectly on time for you to do a little work and really think about the way you want to carry yourself when you get out the other end of this. What business with your soul is it most appropriate to have a reckoning or a conversation with? Could it be that you come out the other side of this as a carrier of story, not just myths, but the stories that edify and nurture your family or immediate community? So if you've ever thought to yourself, one day I'd like to end up on the hill, or, I really should go out and spend some time in the bush, well, maybe that moment has come. So my final urging really would be to take this seriously, to take courage, and to listen deeply to what is being disclosed specifically to you.
Thank you so much. That's really, really, really a generous and beautiful thing to say for everyone to take in and absorb. We've been talking to Martin Shaw on this edition of Connect the Dots. I will be back next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network. And, my usual show salutation is, heads up, stand tall, keep marching forward in company with all our relations. But because of the nature of the time we're in, it's really about sit, be still, and connect with your innate connection to all our relations. Deepen into that connection. Thank you for being with us on today's Connect the Dots, Martin Shaw. And thank you, listeners, for being with us. We'll be back next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Alison Rose Levy. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.